Hey everybody, I'm Chris Metzler. Probably gotten used to seeing my face around as I do these virtual Q&As at SF DocFest. I am director of programming and one of the kind of team here that choose films from all around the world to kind of share with you. As you can see, we're still in this kind of topsy-turvy world of the pandemic, where we have films live and in person at the Roxy, and then also streaming at home. So one of the things that's cool is that we get a chance to kind of do these kind of pre-recorded Q&As. So you just saw the really great film Eternal Spring by the director Jason Loftus. Welcome, Jason.
Thanks for
And
having me, Chris.
just a really wonderful film. And for those that you don't know, Jason's actually an alumni of SF DocFest. He screened with us 2 years ago with his directorial debut, Ask No Questions, which was a really great film too. And so when this one came through programming wise, we were excited to check it out and glad to see it had the goods, and we're excited to have it in San Francisco.
I'm excited to play it there, and I'm thrilled that people can see it in person, even if I can't be there.
Well, maybe a good place to start is, I think many in our audience always wonder, like, how do, filmmakers that screen with us, how do they get their ideas, And then once they have their ideas, like, how do they kind of will these films into existence? So can you give us a little bit of backstory of like, how you stumbled upon the story and then knew that it was, you wanted to go down the rabbit hole of making a documentary about it?
Sure. Yeah, I bet you get a lot of different answers on that one. I think everything is unique. You just have to be curious and looking for those stories. But this one is maybe unusual. I was making a Kung Fu video game a few years ago, and the Kung Fu video game featured a lot of hand-drawn comic art. And we heard about this artist who was originally from China and was living in New York at the time. And he had drawn for Justice League and Star Wars. And he'd also drawn for Louis Cha, who's kind of like the major Kung Fu novelist in China. Everyone knows there's movies made about all his books and stuff. So he had drawn for him as well. So we just thought, okay, perfect. This guy's got the cultural background and he's just an amazing talent. Let's bring him up. And he came up and he helped us draw 1,400 hand-drawn art panels for this narrative video game we were making called Shuyan Saga. And in the midst of working with him, I realized, oh, okay, Dashong is from the same hometown as my wife and filmmaking partner, Masha Loftus. She's from Changchun in Northeast China. And, we started talking and learning about his story and how he came overseas. And we realized he had this amazing story of why he had to leave his home behind and why he had to flee. And my wife, she was the daughter of a mid-level government official in China. She had no connection with the Falun Gong community that Dashong had been part of in China. She had no idea what people had suffered, in her own city under her nose kind of thing, because it's just not reported. And for me, I had an existing, background and interest in the Falun Gong subject and the human rights situation in China. So just combining that with seeing Dashong and how evocative his illustrations were and how remarkable, and he'd already been sketching some of these pieces because you could see that this story really, he was carrying it with him, right? It was something that had impacted his life. So he had sketches of it. So we thought, okay, we do animation in our company. We've done some other animated projects, sort of shorts and an animated preschool series and such. We're like, what if we take Dashong's art and we just start working with him and see if we can bring these things to life? And from there, it was a matter of, okay, let's find, Dashong had some friends he knew who were from Changchun, who were living in New York, who were part of the Falun Gong community. And then sort of from them, we were able to find other people who knew these characters who were responsible for the TV hijacking effort. And then eventually through all of that, we learned that there was one participant in particular who had actually been involved in the TV hijacking and had managed to leave China. So it just sort of happened naturally from there. And what I was really interested in was a few things. One is that, Dashong was obviously, he had some mixed feelings. Obviously, he was very sympathetic of the efforts to get the word out and counter the state narrative that had maligned Falun Gong and also justified this persecution of his shared spiritual belief. But at the same time, he wasn't sure if it was a great idea because the hammer came down so hard and the human cost was so big. So I thought that was interesting because I think the audience might, hearing this, wonder, wow, this is what people suffered. Was it worth it? Why did they do it? And I think this is an opportunity. This starts with a question that we can go explore and try and understand from the perspective of the people who were involved, what was their thinking and how did they look at this event now? So that was interesting to me. And the other thing that was really interesting to me from an artistic and filmmaking standpoint was that there have been some other films that have used animation very effectively for documentary, recreations, but this was an opportunity to not have animation just be a stylistic choice by the filmmaker that's, the invisible hand that's kind of like, hey, this is how we're going to tell these reenactments. In this sense, we're able to like pull the curtain back and allow people to see the process happening, because a third of the film is live action. And you see how the art is essentially part of the story. It is, it's part of Dashong's character arc there, because you see how art is something that allows us to come to an understanding. You see how we see the pain, we see the nostalgia, we see his memories of his home, and you see all of it colored with his own interpretations and his own experiences. You see the trauma of having been arrested and tortured himself. And so there's this layer of authenticity to all of the scenes that he's drawing, because you understand that the artist has lived this and it's a personal story for him. And then you can also see how art helps him to communicate, and art helps him to come to an understanding. So I thought that that was very powerful and something unique that separated it from other films that have used animation for documentary.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that. It makes me wonder, like, what was the kind of collaborative process, in the sense that, like, obviously you as a director, and so in the sense that, it's a big discussion in the documentary community, nowadays, in the sense that for such a long time, it's like, we as filmmakers basically tell other people's stories. And so how, like, was this a collaborative effort? And then at the same sense of that, how did you work together to kind of like tell your story, but also tell the story that, you as a filmmaker wanted to kind of share, that works within a documentary
Yeah,
film?
no, it's a great question. It's a great question. And, it's a unique relationship, I think, here, because, and this was a unique project because, there's one type of production process that typically happens when you're shooting a live action documentary. You might go shoot 100 hours of footage, and then you sit in the edit room and you carve it out and you find the story. It kind of emerges over time. And with animation, you typically have a script that's locked, and then you'll do storyboards and you build an animatic and or like a Leica reel, and then you're basically very clear on the timing before you go do any animation, because animation is very expensive and time consuming. And so we had both of these processes happening at the same time, which sounds like completely contradictory, but and that also related to the relationship we had with Dashong, is that we are following his lead in certain cases, because I wanted him, when he's drawing his memories of his home, or when he's drawing his memories of what took place in the aftermath of the police raids, that opening sort of long shot that we have where you just dive into it, that comes first and foremost from him. Just, hey, just draw me. What was that like? Just draw. And he comes up with ideas, with concepts, with the settings and like what that feels like. And he draws storyboards, and then, we'll take those storyboards, and our animation team will build it in the 3D software in Maya, and we'll use, and basically we'll take pictures with cameras from different perspectives in that software. And then we print them out on physical drawings, but they're just boxes at that point. We've just sort of roughed it out. And then we have him go to work, and he draws all the details of like, hey, this is what this place would be like. This is like an apartment building background. This is the, like, and he draws it, but because he's drawing it from different camera angles that we've printed out, we can then drape them into the software in the 3D space. And then what happens is you get that as you're moving through, the camera's moving through the 3D space, you constantly see a 2D illustration, but it has depth and perspective, right? So this is a little bit of the relationship that, parts of it, we wanted to come straight from him because we wanted it to be him telling his story and really relaying his experiences. And then other parts of it, it's just like when it comes to the overall arc with Liang and Big Truck and all this, it's like, give us the characters, give us the environments. We're going to cut it together like a traditional documentary. We're going to find the story from the interviews. And in a sense, it's like he's participating all along. So he knows all the story, but he doesn't know how we're telling it. And actually I saved it. There was a year after he had finished most of his drawing work for us, where we were cutting this in the edit. And he didn't ask me to share it with him. I didn't share it with him. I just thought, you know what, it'll be a surprise. You'll see it at the festival. But also there's the relationship part too, where it's like the filmmaker and the subject, where it's like, he is a subject, and he's like a participant in the sense that he's a creative collaborator in parts of it. And then in other aspects, it's like, I'm going to tell your story. And so there's a lot of trust that was required for Dashong to be able to contribute to something where he knows artistically his name, his work, his personal story is going to be on there. but at the same time to be hands off and just trust that, hey, we're going to figure something out and we're going to tell his story, and he's a subject rather than the keys, the one driving the bus in terms of telling the story. And I think it was a bit of a unique relationship and maybe wouldn't work in a lot of cases, but fortunately with Dashong, he was a willing participant in that and able to work that way.
That's cool. I think it turned out really in an interesting way, and I can see how, I think the film kind of you kind of peel it back in different layers, and so I could see how that process created that feeling. And so, I mean, I think another question for the folks that participate in the film is that, was there any ever hesitancy of like revisiting it in the sense of just post-traumatic
Traumatic stress, yeah.
or even just the idea of like even though it's important, I think we can definitely argue for the story to share, but like, does it put friends or family that are still back home in danger, or is it one of those things where the folks, they just having a chance to kind of amplify this message, and a film obviously creates a megaphone for it. So yeah, what was that process of getting people to kind of come on board and share their stories?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I mean, on the last part of that, the security issue was an interesting one, and I think I learned from that as well, which was, a lot of these people were they just could not wait to tell their story in some regards, which is they had been through so much and, survived in many cases torture, imprisonment, all of this. And they went through all of that saying that they wanted to be able to tell this story. So it didn't take a lot of convincing, but beyond that, from a practical standpoint, they also taught me something, which is that the best way to protect people who were close to them or even themselves was to shine a light on what was going on. And this is like when you meet with witnesses who were in the labor camps, for example, and they say, hey, they were tortured badly. And then all of a sudden the guards lit up on them someday and they didn't know why. And then later on you find out, oh, well, once they get out of China, they realize there was someone outside of China who had called the labor camp and said, I know what you're up to, or there was a report, just a name was mentioned in a human rights report or some media report. There was someone was appealing and trying to draw attention to their case in China. So those kinds of things have a huge impact. So their ability to tell their own story was very, very powerful. And this I kind of related because I mentioned, how we got involved in the game or in this film was through a video game we were working on with Dashong. That video game was being published by Tencent. And I touched on this in the last film because the last film, Ask No Questions, was actually made in the middle of this one. This one took like 5-6 years to work on. And so Ask No Questions kind of happened in the midst of working on this. And we were making both films and interviewing subjects while we were finishing this video game, and Tencent was going to publish it. And they're a huge media company in China and one of the major players in the gaming space. And just in the midst of our launch, the Chinese government contacts them, and all of a sudden our game disappears from the storefronts in the midst of its launch. And our rep eventually tells us, hey, are you doing something not aligned with the Chinese government direction? We were told to cut ties with your company. And at the same time, my wife's family members who are in Changchun in the area in Northeast China, and the Public Security Bureau starts contacting family members. We figure through WeChat because we figured there was some complicity there with WeChat because it's the app that was used for both some of the business contacts and family contacts. And, and they were pressured. But what I'd learned from these individuals who were coming out of China is, if the regime applies pressure or threatens you and they realize that can be used to silence you, then they know that they can do more of that, right? And so, okay, well, this gets him to behave, so let's just do more of him. Let's threaten this, let's threaten that. Whereas if they do something and instead you turn around and you expose it, it actually removes some of that incentive. So in that case, like I recorded the call I had with my rep at Tencent, I included it in the last film to show the kind of pressures and interference that journalists and filmmakers were facing by trying to probe these subjects. So it had that kind of effect. Yeah, but with the people in China or coming out of China, they were adamant that they wanted to tell their stories, and partly because they, that it would provide them some security, but partly because they had been through so much. And they also felt that there were a number of individuals in China who did not survive. And I heard this repeated multiple times, which is like, I feel this onus to carry on. I survived. I don't understand why I survived and they did not survive, but I just feel like they wanted to tell this message. They died because they wanted to. So I feel I should carry that message on. And we heard that kind of theme a few times from the subjects that we were interviewing.
Wow. Well, I have another question on that front, but before I forget, and not to kind of ask a more lightweight question, but I want to make sure that we discuss it. Is that you talk about your guys' involvement in kind of video games and things? Can you tell us a little bit about your background as a filmmaker, and then also how do you think kind of storytelling and kind of narrative techniques differ between video games and in films, and what's the kind of crossover there?
Yeah, I probably have, in terms of mediums, I probably have a bit of an attention deficit issue. I like to play in different spaces. I find that different mediums are very, I don't think there's one that's better than the others. I think that different stories and, and different experiences lend themselves to different platforms, basically. And so we've done a number of narrative games. We've done a documentary series. We had a series called Confucius Was a Foodie, which was, I think it won like 8 Taste Awards. It was best food series on television in 2021 at the Taste Awards there. And it's aired in like 100 territories. So we've done that. We've done some preschool stuff. We have like a early Mandarin language education preschool show. That's a lot of fun, called Meow Meow. So I've had some digital. We do VR, and actually we're doing a VR film right now, a short that kind of goes along with Eternal Spring that we're working on. I find virtual reality is interesting because it doesn't lend itself to the same narrative storytelling. Like, first of all, it's very hard to empathize with an external character because it is first person experience, right? So you essentially are the character. So in the way in a film where you would establish who your main character is and you want people to develop empathy and see their story and empathize with them, it doesn't work in the same way. Also, you don't control the shot in the same way. So you want a close up to communicate some emotion, and then you want a wide shot to communicate other things. You do that in VR, all of a sudden someone's right in your face and it's very uncomfortable. So it doesn't work at all in the same way. The storytelling conventions break down, but it's extremely powerful for creating empathy and for putting someone into someone else's shoes. And you try to achieve some of that with a narrative, like with a feature length film, whether it's documentary or narrative, you try to achieve that. But in VR, you walk a mile in someone else's shoes. So if you want to know what someone else went through and really carry that first person experience with you, then I think VR has a lot of potential. And so we're taking a personal story of Mr. White that we never really explored in great depth in the film because he's mostly there as a conduit to Liang and Big Truck. But we're taking Mr. White's personal experience from before there was a crackdown and before he even, like, just when he first encountered Falun Gong and through to the end, and everything that he went through, and being separated from his wife, and and interrogations and all these types of things, and then eventually coming out of China. So we're putting that through a first person experience that is built with partly live action and partly animation in a 360 space. So we play in different mediums, and I've did a film about bullying with a bunch of Hollywood celebrities a couple of years ago, just before Ask No Questions as a producer. The first 2 films that I took on as a director were Ask No Questions and Eternal Spring, both dealing with the human rights and misinformation subject in China and centered around Falun Gong. That was just a subject that I felt people was poorly understood, and also just a source for some really remarkable stories that just weren't, maybe because of the sensitivity of it and all that, just weren't really some things that people had encountered. Most people had no idea that the TV was hijacked in China 20 years ago. And it's like, you hear about that and you're like, really, that happened? So there's these, that's the 2 films that I've been directing in the feature length. And then beyond that, we're launching another narrative video game, a sci-fi fantasy animated series that goes with it as well this next year. So just kind of all over the map.
Well, very cool. I really appreciate that you're kind of taking on some interesting challenges, and I think the work stands for itself. And
Chris, there's something I should say about that too. Is like, I find that every medium you work in, you take something else with you, because I had a comment from someone who saw the film Eternal Spring and said, oh, it had this kind of like video game aesthetic to it. And I was really racking my brain, like, where did you see a video game in there? And I thought, oh, you know what? It's probably the sort of little character profile images that pop up. It's almost as though, because we've made like visual novels or like narrative games. And for me, it's like subconscious, right? It's like you go and you're like, when we're making the film, it's like, well, how do we help people to keep track of who is who in this film, right? Because admittedly, we're dealing with, a lot of characters. We try to narrow it in as much as possible, but also the names are maybe unfamiliar at times for people. So how do we make this something that people can follow? And so we went with these little character icons. And for me, it was just intuitive, working together with our editor, Dave, who came up with this. but then I think about it, it's like, oh yeah, maybe that's partly the game background, where you see these things. So every medium you work in, you kind of learn about what works best in that medium, but then you also carry some things that I think help you when you return to, whatever your preferred form is, whether that's documentaries or, feature films.
Right. No, it's interesting how those kind of tools pop up in different ways. And it's the thing kind of, as a programmer, it's really exciting seeing the different films go through there, because you see all the different kind of perspectives that people bring to stuff, not just there's the stories they choose, but even the way they tell their stories.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I imagine that some of the audience are going to ask, I mean, I see this just as just a really great story, but given the kind of underlying issues that you explore, people might say, what can I do to kind of, help make the world better? Or like, if there was kind of a call to action, is there anything that you think that we can do individually to kind of help raise awareness, of this, or even kind of, help make a change in China?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I'll be fully honest on that. It's something that we're thinking about, like as a filmmaker, first and foremost. We cared about the subject, but we cared almost like entirely just about telling the story because it moved us and we wanted to tell other people about it. And so then we start, as we get out there on the festival run and people are saying, well, what can I do? And it's like, yeah, great question. So, we are looking at those things. I think first of all, I think the film has a certain power in the sense that it's a subject that people may not have been familiar with. So if you've enjoyed this film and you felt that it opened your eyes to something that was going on, I think awareness is first and foremost a key thing. So let people know about the film. If you caught this at the Roxy and you're like, wow, I should tell someone else, there's not another show, hey, it's still streaming at the SF Doc Fest, tell people about it, check it out online. I think that would be super appreciated. But what we're working on in the meantime is the film's played at a number of human rights festivals. And so I've gotten to learn more about the impact side of things and how we can have an impact through this film to help the people who are in China. We're looking specifically at a couple of individuals who are in the film that we'd like to shine a light on. Jo Run-jun, Auntie Jo in the film. She's her prison term is supposed to be up this year. We're struggling to find any detail information about how she's doing or what might be happening with her situation, but we are going to follow that. So people's raising questions, especially if you want to talk with a local representative and say, hey, put in a word to China to say what's going on with Auntie Jo, what's going on with Jo Run-jun, who was sentenced for this, what's her condition. We know one individual who is animated in the film, but we don't discuss him at length. He's sort of a background character just for the purposes of focusing the story because of this story that we had and the witnesses. It doesn't mean that he wasn't actually an integral part of the TV hijacking effort. But Sun Chang-jun, apparently he's been released and he's under some kind of house arrest. We're struggling to get details about him as well. But again, people who see this and want to ask about those characters who are still alive but have been in prison in China, ask a local representative to send a message to China. That helps. We know from people who've been victims inside China that when those kind of questions are raised and attention is drawn around them, that it can legitimately help their situation. So that would be greatly appreciated.
And so, if folks want to be able to reach out and either kind of follow the progress of the film or have questions for you, what's the best way to reach out to you?
I think everything centrally from the website, eternalspringfilm.com. There you'll find us and we'll have links to all of our social media because the two films that we've done recently both touch on overlapping subjects in China. We're using the same social handle. So it's all just Lofty Sky Docs across all of our different social platforms. But if you don't remember that, if you go to eternalspringfilm.com, it'll have the social media channels there as well for you to connect with.
Very cool. And, Jason, again, thank you for sharing your new film with us. And, we're your kind of grassroots street team. So if you watch this film, you love it, kind of post about it on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, just say, hey, I saw this great movie, Eternal Spring, and you should check it out when it comes down. I can tell you, myself as a film programmer, we watch and see what other people are wanting to get, and we reach out and bring it. So be the kind of change in the world that can be. So thanks again, Jason, and have a great day.
Thank you so much, Chris. And thanks to everyone in San Francisco. Hope you enjoy the film.
Thanks.